A team that was not must-see television this year, though. Caleb Porter's
Nice.
New England Revolution, eliminated on the 5th of October, 3 years removed from a points record-setting Supporter Shield run. The New England Revs have missed the playoffs for the second time in the last 3 years. Caleb Porter has had a nightmare of a run, and we'll hope that 2025 brings better tidings. However, we should look back at 2024 to see what went wrong. Yeah.
Probably still the same. Again, this is. Uh, I know we didn't cover them in what went wrong last year because technically they made the playoffs, but if we were going to cover them in a what went wrong, this would be a repeat again for me on this first one, and that's off the field issues. This to me is the biggest thing plaguing the New England Revolution right now because on paper, at least in my opinion, this team should be a playoff team. You have a former MVP, you have a former Juventus player, and you have arguably the best left back prospect in the country on your team. They even brought in a manager who has experience winning in this league, and they still fell way short of at least my expectations. And my guess is that the locker room is a big reason why that was. And the incident that seemingly kickstarted all of this was Bruce Arena investigation last season, which tore apart the locker room. And New England hasn't been the same since then, even throughout this entire season. Porter was coming into a tough situation this year with the goal of uniting the locker room again, but clearly he wasn't able to do so. And the symbol that he wasn't able to do so, I think, was in the fight that happened in September between Carlos Heel and Xavier Arriaga. And that doesn't just happen out of nowhere. So that was clearly the result of some kind of locker room animosity, or maybe even from on the field as well, building up. The unrest is building up, and then it just eventually blows over. So, in my opinion, until they can fix that locker room, it doesn't matter what coach you bring in, this team will continue to underperform.
Yeah, I can't disagree with there. I'm going to go one and two here because you had 2 points that kind of merged into or you had 1 point that kind of merged my two. So I
Yeah,
started with
go
the
for it.
2024. I started with 2024 hangover, like you mentioned, right? All this off the field drama, not on the field tactics, starting with the Bruce Arena dismissal, the team holding out until certain front office staff were removed or clarity was restored. I mean, it was a whole nightmare. And there were all this stuff in between, and it felt like that lingered over the team more prevalently than more prevalently than the actual season itself, right? Instead of being able to focus on another MLS Cup run or Supporter Shield challenges or Leagues Cup or whatever, they were left with social media questions around why we still don't know what happened to Bruce Arena, even though we kind of do, and why the coaches who asked for his removal were then promoted inside the team. It wasn't the right way to start off the season. And then from there, I mentioned that it was basically Caleb Porter versus the world, right? So you talk about that really bad locker room. That locker room started because I don't think Caleb Porter ever had control of that locker room. He lost confidence in his center backs, which is something we'll talk about in a little bit here, for no reason whatsoever. He had on the field arguments with players in the middle of games. I remember him and Nick Lima going at it. You mentioned the Carlos Hill, Xavier Arriaga thing. It just felt like Caleb Porter never really had control of the locker room. And that even stretched out to the media, right? He got into an argument with the media who basically asked, hey, why is Dave Romney not starting? And he went on a whole minute and a half rant about why the media should be doing his job instead of him and never answered the question. Just got really, really angry for no reason whatsoever. Like, it was a fair question. Like, hey, why is Dave not playing? Oh, Dave hasn't really fit in with the system yet. He's not really doing whatever, or he's hurt, or whatever. That's all he needs to say. 10 seconds. Instead, he went on this minute and a half long rant against this poor reporter who was just asking questions. And I can tell you from experience that when you lose the locker room, it's impossible for a team to perform properly because if they don't trust you, they're not going to trust your tactics. They're not going to be trusting of your instructions, and they're going to be hesitant to implement all of it, which is what we saw here. It got so bad that the team had to enter this quasi rebuild mode, right? Sending DeJuan Jones, Noel Buck, Henry Kessler out the door. Will Sands, Tim Parker, and some cash came in. But if Porter doesn't gain the trust of these players soon, it's going to be a really long 25 season, and I don't think he lasts very long there because you need to have the locker room bought into your ideas.
Yeah, I mean, based on what you were saying, like I didn't even remember majority of these things happening other than like the scuffle in the locker room, but it doesn't sound like Porter's got anywhere close to claiming this locker room right now. So I feel like in that case, you got to either you got to either bring in a new coach and try that route again, or you got to like cycle out a bunch of players and kind of rebuild, which seems to be the direction they're going in. So maybe they're sticking with Porter and just cycling out players and restarting in that regard. But who knows? Maybe they go the direction of just cycling out everybody and just going with a completely fresh new start. But on the topic of possibly cycling players out, my second point was a lack of production from designated players this season.
Oh
And
wow, that was original.
yeah, so original. Definitely didn't just cover this as well. So, in my opinion, and decent chance I'll catch flack from some New England fans out there for this one, but I think this was Carl's Heel's worst season in a New England shirt. And I think the blow up with Arriaga was the sign that maybe he wasn't fully focused on the field and was possibly distracted by these off the field issues. And for me, he has to be the main catalyst of this team. But he shouldn't really be getting all the blame because even though he wasn't exactly up to his typical standards, which is a very high bar, he was still miles clear of the other quote unquote star players on the team. Brioni has struggled since he started with New England. And while this was his best year so far in New England, in my opinion, it still was just quite frankly not good enough. I mean, 9 goals scored in 2,100 minutes is just flat out not good enough from your striker, especially when you have Carl's Heel creating for you, who is one of the, if not the best playmaker in the entire league. On top of that, Chunkalai, a guy who came in last year and looked really promising, was injured most of this season. But even when he was healthy, he was only getting 3 goal contributions in about 1,000 minutes. So still not being very productive when he was out there. I mean, the best teams in the league are getting much better production out of your star designated players. Look at teams like LAFC, Columbus, Inter Miami. Their designated players are the focal point for these teams. They're the ones producing, they're the ones getting it done. That needs to be the case for New England as well. So they need to get much better production out of these guys because honestly, that could, in my opinion, that could be a way that you can kind of get the locker room back together again. If you see some of these key guys coming in, performing really well, you start getting better results on the field, players start to get a bit happier, and I think that can maybe get the locker room to be cohesive again. But poor play on the field and poor play from designated players is definitely not going to help the situation in the locker room. So I think that's got to be a big thing to look at for this offseason, whether you move on or you have faith that they're going to turn things around for next season.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's fair. I think your designated players are only as impactful usually based on the players that are around them. So if you aren't supporting them well, they'll tend to struggle. And I point to Ricky Puig as somebody like that, right? Like he was good, not stand out the year last year, I think it was. And then they brought in Peck and they brought in Paintsill and Jovic got healthy and he became an MVP candidate. So, I think it's a 50-50 there, but I don't disagree with you that they needed to be better regardless of what they did. And again, I think a coach that they believe in fixes that too. So all ties together. But my last point, because I doubled up here, is also player specific and it's defensive specific, right? We talked about Porter not trusting his center backs, and he wasn't a fan of the options that he was provided when he entered the Rev setup. And it's almost like at Football Manager when you walk in, you're like, all right, let me see what I got. Bunch of 2-star center backs, you're gone, right? After just a year in New England, Henrik Ravas was sent packing back to Poland. He made it very clear that he wasn't thrilled with the center backs either, right? He went on to bring in Xavier Arriaga and Tim Parker with Ivicic in the goal. He also sent Henry Kessler and DeJuan Jones packing. And all this moving in and out, New England had the worst defensive record in the East and close to the worst defensive record in the league. Can't do that when your defenders aren't doing the job. And, clearly bringing in just new faces wasn't getting things done. So he might need to go back to the drawing board there. But you didn't make the playoffs, not because of the defenders that you had, but I think because of the defensive shape that you were trying to play in. You didn't, I don't really remember off the top of my head who their true number 6 would be to protect and shield that group. Yes, Al Hassan Youssef in central midfield, and Matt Polster was sitting in front of them too. That's true. And it seems like there were just some players that weren't doing the job, and it might have been a tactical thing, right? I'll be honest with you, I haven't watched a ton of New England, so maybe our New England friends can help us out there and let us know. But clearly something wasn't working because you were beating. I mean, you gave up the most goals in the conference. That's not good.
No, it is not. That's the expert analysis we pay for. My last point is a lack of reinvestment. So New England brought in about, and I apologize that this is all going to be in euros. You can blame transfer market, those euro snobs. But New England brought in about 12 million in euros from the sales of Buxa and Turner back in the 2022 season, as well as 16 million euros from the Petrovic sale in the 2023 season. Despite that, the only time they have spent more than 4 million on anybody was Langoni in this latest summer transfer window. I feel like they tried to get too cute with bringing in under the radar players and it backfired on them. And don't get me wrong, I'm 100% a fan of take your time with reinvesting, don't rush it, find the right pieces to bring in. But one, they clearly haven't gotten it right, regardless of how much time they've taken. And two, I think they've arguably taken too long to reinvest when your star player, Carlos Heel, is in his prime. And I feel like you should be investing around him to get the most out of his prime now and trying to win. They should be building for Heel to win now because he has proven to be the type of player that you build around. He is a former MVP. He is 100% the person that should be the focal point.
I think there's a lot of things that we could sit here and talk about. I think there is a
Probably.
ton. There's a ton that New England will need to fix. But the wonderful thing about this league is three good signings, and they might actually be top of the conference next year. So one to keep an eye on for sure.